All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop a couple of things in the chat right now. The first thing will be the slides. Like with my talk on Tuesday, I'm not going to be working directly from these slides because I'll just have Excel up the whole time. But it does contain like step-by-step instructions about how to do specific things in Excel. And so if you miss any of my instructions, I'm just trying to clear up some of my sorry about that. I'm just about to send this out. But yeah, I will be working from Excel, but if you miss anything that I have been talking about, then you can look at these slides to find the information and you can use them as a reference afterwards. So the other thing I'm sending out is the data that we'll be working from, which is the Excel spreadsheet that I'll have on my screen. And I'm going to go ahead and pull that up now. So yeah, I see in the chat some people were asking about the previous one. I will be sending those the files out to Diana to be made available, like with the link to the video. So share screen. Okay. So this is the example data that I'm going to be using today. And just to quickly introduce you to what this is supposed to convey, this is a made-up data set for a possible study that potentially could be conducted. And it's just meant to demonstrate how to work with data with lots of variables here. So in this data set, we have 12 participants that are labeled P1 to P12, and each participant has 6 data points. 3 of them from task A and 3 of them from task B. The participants are also divided into 4 groups, A, B, C, and D, and they're labeled for their gender and their birth year. And there are 2 measured variables in this data set, reaction time and the number of times they clicked on something. So you can decide what this study is testing. I don't personally know. This just seemed like something that could be a study. So anyway, when you're dealing with this type of data, where you have a lot of variables, a lot of independent variables, sometimes multiple dependent variables as well, you usually want to be able to summarize it in a lot of different ways. You're going to want to be able to see what the patterns are across, whether that's across experimental groups or task or the gender of the participants. And sometimes you may want to test some of these things nested inside each other as well. And normally to do this in Excel, you would need to sort your data a lot of different ways and find averages or write these complicated formulas to highlight just some of the cells and then just some of the others to get different combinations. But what Excel's pivot table function does is it's a way to have Excel do the work for you and to create tables where you can easily choose the variables that it reports and then shuffle them around quickly. So let's start out by just inserting one. So to add a pivot table, what you do is you go to the Insert tab and you click somewhere within your data set. You could also highlight your whole data set, but also if you just click somewhere inside it, it will choose the correct set of data for you. You click Pivot Table and it tells the range it's selected. It's automatically selected this whole data set from top to bottom that I created. Let's see there. It's selected the whole thing. And you tell it you want the pivot table to be placed in a new worksheet. And so what it does here is you'll see it pulls up a new sheet that has a blank space for a table on the left. And on the right, it has this panel over here that has a list of all the variables, all the column headers from your data. And then also in this panel, you have 4 empty boxes labeled filters, columns, rows, and values. And to start out creating a table, what you're going to want is to have a variable in rows and a variable in values. So I'll go ahead and show what that looks like. So the most important thing is values. That's going to be your dependent variable. So here, that would be something like reaction time. And what you do is you click on reaction time and you drag it to the box that says values. So what it initially does is, see here it says sum of reaction time. What Excel automatically does with pivot tables is to report the sum of all your variable. So this is adding together all the reaction times in the data. And obviously this is not very useful. You don't usually need to know sums of reaction times. So we're going to want to change this to an average. And the way you do that is you go over here on the right to the drop-down menu beside reaction time. You choose value field settings. And here it's got different ways that you can summarize your data. And usually the one that you're going to want to use is average, what we're going to be doing here. But there's also sum. So for example, if you're looking at like how much money was spent purchasing a bunch of different products, then finding the sum of how much money that is could be exactly what you need. Or if you're trying to tally up how many times a particular word was used, then count could be useful. And they also have maximum, minimum, product, standard deviation. It gets more complex as it goes down, but usually what you'll need is average. So you just click OK, and we find out the average reaction time overall is 154. And this is way too many decimals, so I'm going to go over to home and tell it to decrease the decimal places to make that more manageable. All right, so now we've got our dependent variable, which is reaction time. And so let's pick an independent variable to categorize it by. So we'll start just by doing it by participant. And what you do is you take participant and you drag it to rows. And this pops up so that it tells you the average reaction time for each participant and then the overall average at the bottom. To make this, so this already is like super useful and is just showing you your data very clearly. But to make it even easier to read, you can do things like sort the data. So suppose that you want to see your reaction times from fastest to slowest. To do that, you can click on the cell that says somewhere in the reaction time column, right click, and then there's a sort option on the menu. You can say sort smallest to largest. And so now it sorts them from the fastest reaction time to the slowest, and you can see that participant 2 was the fastest, participant 12 was the slowest. So that's the basics just to get started out with the table. Are there any questions about this part?
Sorry, I was following until a couple seconds ago, but my pivot table fields thing on the right side of the screen kind of disappeared. Do you know how to get that back? Sorry,
usually, usually what that means is that you clicked outside of the table, and usually if you click back inside the table, it will come back.
Oh,
Does it not do that? If it doesn't, then there should be a way to pull up the panel, but does it work?
It did actually right now.
Okay, great.
I clicked on it. Thank you.
Yeah, it just does that sometimes, but that will bring it back.
Thank you.
All right. So now let's just look at some different variables. We're still looking at reaction time. Let's try some different independent variables. And to get rid of a variable, you click on it like in the rows box and just drag it out. And that just gets rid of it. And now you can try it a new way. So let's try it by group. So here we can see that group B had the fastest reaction times. Group D had the slowest. Then you can take out group. You can look at it by task. You can see those are about the same. And you can do that for all of your variables. You can also do that with gender, where you see male and female participants had almost identical reaction times. And now let's look at birth year, because that one's a little interesting because it's a numeric variable. So each of the participants in this data set has a different birth year. So it's kind of hard to immediately see any patterns. You're just kind of looking at this. They are in order from earliest birth date to most recent, but it's just kind of a a soup on the side because there's so many. And then also if some of your participants did have the same birth year, then like some of these would be representing one person and some would be representing two. So that's not necessarily very useful. So one thing we could do is to group these participants by decades. And a way to do that is to click inside the birth year column, right click, just like you did for sort, and this says group. And so what it does is it pulls up a grouping box, and this can allow you to take your numeric data and to bin it into sections. So since I want it by decades, I'm going to say going from 1970 to 1999 by 10 years. And what that does is it groups them into the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and shows the average reaction time for each one. And you can very clearly here see that as the participants get younger, their reaction times get faster. Another thing you can do is that you can always replace the labels with your own things. You can just type 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and it will save this and continue to label them that way. If it ends up needing to put the labels in two places, it will replace all of them. So it's really useful. So now let's see, how does grouping work when you're not dealing with a numeric variable? Because you saw like this required you to bin the birth years into ranges. So what do you do when you're dealing with a text-based variable? Well, for that, let's look at the variable of group. And I'll take off the one for birth year and add in group. So what do you do if you want to group group A and group B together? So here you highlight the two of them, you right click and you say group, and it sorts these together. And then if you also want to do C and D, you can highlight those, tell it group, and it will create a group 2. So that is how to do grouping for numeric variables and also for categorical ones. So does anybody have any questions about sorting and grouping or anything like that? Let's see, something in the chat. Okay. All right, so we'll move on to the next thing. So one thing you'll notice with what I've just done here with the grouping is that it gives you a heading and these little subheadings beneath it so that you have one variable called group and one, actually, to make it easier to look at, just go over here onto the side in rows. You see that it has two variables, one called group and one called group 2. So this is kind of an example of what happens if you drag two variables into the rows box. So let's see what that looks like when we're working with the already established variables. Let's take these out. So one thing you can do is have like group as one of your rows and participant as another. And so what this ends up doing is it shows you your overall groups. It shows you group A, B, C, and D, and the average for those. But it also puts the participants that were included in these groups as subsets beneath them and shows their individual scores so that you can look at your data as first on the scale of groups and then as participants. Let's see. And it does matter what order that you put these two in. So for example, if you had participant on top instead of group, then it would put the participant in bold and the group letter beneath it, and that would not be useful at all because each participant is only in one group, so it would just be duplicating the information. So you would want to make sure you have them nested in a way that makes sense. And then also, if this ends up being too much information, if you have it sorted like this, and then you realize you don't want to look at the participants, you can just click this box on the side and it will minimize them. So you're just looking at the groups again. How do you keep the multiple tables? So they do go away pretty quickly. It's not really meant to be saved. I think one thing you can do is to take the table to paste it out to the side. And I think if you change one, okay, yeah. If you take a table and paste it out to the side and then you make edits to the first one, then the second one won't change. And to do that, you might want to create another sheet in Excel and like paste all your tables there. So I will go ahead and delete all that. Okay. So you can also look at multiple dependent variables at one time as well. So in this data set, going back to the data, we had both reaction time and number of clicks. And so to do that, you can drag your dependent variable into values, and it will just put the two of them in columns beside each other. And as you can see, it automatically did clicks as sum, and we would prefer to have them as averages. So you go and fix that. So here this is an example of what it looks like to have one independent variable, two dependent variables. You can also have two of each, so that have like group, task, and then the two out to the side. So this shows how to use the rows and the values boxes. But what do you do? What is the columns box for? Right now, it's being filled up by values, but is it possible to put your variables in there as well? And the answer is yes. For one thing, you can use columns in the exact way that you would use rows. So for example, you could just say that you would like to have group in columns. Let's see. And values in rows. You could have it switched. Typically, it's easier to just have your independent variables in your rows because it tends to be a little more compact and doesn't stretch off the screen. But you can always just switch rows and columns if that's something that you want to do. But also, you can put your variables, you can have variables in both rows and columns. So for example, each participant, and I'll go ahead and have the rows for participant. Each participant did two tasks, task A and task B, and they may have gotten different results in these different tasks. So you can look at this by putting task in rows and see, you can see participant 2, task A, task B, participant 6, task A, task B. But again, that's kind of hard to look at. It's kind of hard to compare the results to each other. Your eyes have to jump from top to bottom all over the place. And so one way that makes this a lot easier is if you do participant in rows and task in columns. And let's take out reaction time because it can be very difficult to look at two variables at once. So let's just look at clicks. So it's suddenly much easier to see your results. You can very clearly see now that the numbers in column A tend to be, let's see, I'm clicked in the wrong place. They tend to be lower than the ones in column B. So something about task B required the participants to click more. And this is usually good for just looking at one dependent variable rather than multiple ones, but it can be a way of summarizing your data in a multi-dimensional way. So are there any questions about how to do rows and columns? All right. So now let's take a look at the last field, which is filters. And what filters does is it allows you to get rid of any data that you don't want or need, or just to look at a subset of your data. So for example, I have this column called bad data. And what I did in the data set here is that a few of these are just labeled 1. So the ones that say 0, those are good data. And the ones that say 1, for some reason in the experimental process, the participants messed up and we need to throw that data out. So what this does is it brings up a filter in the top left corner, and you can choose which data you want to look at. So here I only want the good data points, so I'm going to select 0, click OK, and the numbers shift to reflect that we have cut out all the bad data. In some cases, if you have more than 2 options, so like if it's A, B, C, and D, you can do select multiple items and you just choose multiple ones that you want to do. But here, since there's only 2, you don't need to do that. You just select 0 and it works. You can also use filters to just like look at one thing at a time. So for example, maybe you only want to look at task A. Whoops, put that in the wrong spot. And so you can click that you just want task A, and it will reduce your table to only look at that. Another thing you can do is that, say you want to know how much data was eliminated for each participant. You want to know how much of how much of your data is left after eliminating the bad data. And that can be somewhere where this count function comes in handy. So if you change, we know that each participant was supposed to have 6 data points. So you can go into value field settings and choose count. And it turns out that some of them do still have 6 data points, but several of them now only have 5 or 4. And you can see how that breaks down. So that's an example of where the count function can be helpful. Another thing you might run into is that if you update your data on this sheet over here, the original one, the pivot table is not actually live. It does not update when you update your data. So to get things to update, you have to use this button under Pivot Table Analyze. I'm having trouble clicking it because of all the zoom things up here. Okay, this says refresh. And so let's look at an example of when you might need to refresh. So suppose you've learned that something was wrong with participant 9's test, and they did something incorrectly, and you just need, no, count does not show the whole sum. Count shows how many cells have data in them for that participant or for that category. To do sum, you would need to select sum. And that would, for what we had here, that would tell how many clicks. It would do the sum of all the clicks. So I will go back and show the difference for that. So for count, you're getting numbers like, I will make these easier to look at. You're getting numbers like 5 and 6 and 4. If you do the sum, it's going to be an average of about 3 for each one. And so you're going to get how many, the sum of all the clicks for those participants. So that will be very different. Let's see. So going back to participant 9, where was it? Okay, so say participant 9, something is wrong with all their data. There was an error, the machine wasn't working correctly when you tested them. You need to throw them out completely. So you'll replace all of theirs to say bad data so that it will throw them out. And then say you like test a new participant to replace them. So you get participant 13 and you want to add participant 13's data to replace participant 9. So you'll go into your pivot table and you will click refresh. And see here, this got rid of participant 9 because now they've been filtered out by bad data, but it didn't add participant 13. And the reason for that is the data source is still only going up to line 73. So what you need to do here is in Pivot Table Analyze, you go into Change Data Source, and where it says H73, you scroll down and it's line 79 is now at the bottom. So you do 79. Okay. And now it adds in participant 13. And we can now find like what, how that affects all our different results for things like task and group and so forth. So we'll go ahead and bring this back to the way it looked before. So now that is how you update your data when you make changes to it. So are there any questions about this part? All right, then I will move on to the last thing for this. And the last thing, oh, let's see if there's a question. Show which part again? The the pivot table analyze, yes. So that is a tab at the top along with the home tab, insert and so forth. And pivot table analyze has some buttons that are specific to just the pivot table. And so what I did is to update data that's already within the range. You click refresh and that will automatically update anything like changing the values in the cells that are already there. And if you need to change the source of the data, like to expand to include more rows or columns, you'll click here and it will say adjust table range, and you can highlight to change that to make it wider or longer or so forth. And I will say cancel because it was already what I wanted it to be. But that's pivot table analyze. It's got a few other things as well, but those are the most important ones. There's also a design tab, which is mainly for some of the aesthetics of what it looks like. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. All right, so now I'm going to go into charts. And so also in this pivot table analyze tab, there's something called pivot chart. And what this does is it allows you to create graphs out of a pivot table that you've already created. So here you click on pivot chart and it brings up Excel's standard graph functions, and you can choose a chart type. So typically you'll probably want something like a bar graph. So we'll go ahead and choose this one. And it will show task A, task B by participant, average of clicks. And then if you want to change what your graph looks like, you just shuffle your fields around, and whatever you change in your pivot table will also change in your chart. So if you want to replace participant with group, your chart will automatically update and will be very easy to switch things around. And it's also very easy to do things like switch the X and the Y axis. So you can, like now you have task A and task B separate, and you have it grouped into the 4 groups. I think it looked better the other way, so I'll switch it back. But you can just shuffle these around. Maybe you want to have it, instead of broken down by group, you want to have it broken down by gender. And you can just continue to swap all these out until you're satisfied with it. And then when you get a graph you're happy with and you don't want it to change anymore, you click on the graph, you copy it, you paste it. Let's see, get it to paste. Why is it not pasting? Okay, there it goes. And down here where it says control, you will paste it as a picture. And then it won't update anymore. And you can also do that so that it pastes into like a Word document or something like that. You can also make edits to the chart to just change what it looks like. So you can go into design and change the colors so that it uses different color scales. You can also specifically like change the colors yourself, and it will like automatically change several of them at once. I'm going to take it off gender and do it on group again because that's can be easier to look at. Another thing you can do is anything you change on the pivot table, like with the text, will also update on the graph itself. So if you decide to relabel these as group A, group B, those will change the labels on the graph as well. And let's see. Yeah. And then you can continue to format this by like going to, let's see, I think it's design. You can add chart element. You can have it have an axis title so that you say, these are the groups. You can have it add vertical axis and say this is the average clicks. And you can have it add things like labels to the data, a chart title. This is starting to get kind of cramped, so you can make it a little bigger. You can have it add the legend on the side or take it away. You can have it add labels to the data, things like that. You can this is the same way that Excel's standard graphs work, but it's specifically drawing the data from the pivot table so that you don't have to organize it yourself. And you can also change the type of graph. So for example, if you want to work with birth year instead, for that, you might want to have something like a line graph, and can go to, let's see, change chart type under design and have it do a line graph to show the differences over time. And here, maybe you don't want to have it be in group by decade anymore. You'd like it to just show it over time. So you can right click and choose ungroup. And see how that results with the graph. So does anybody have any questions about the pivot charts? So that sort of wraps up on a lot of the things that I wanted to go over about pivot tables, but now I'll just open it up. Does anybody have any questions about how any of this works? Anything that I should repeat and go over again, or additional questions that I didn't get to? Can I open the graph again? Okay, yes. So to create a graph, what you do is you select inside your pivot table, you go to Pivot Table Analyze, and over here on the right is Pivot Chart. You click on that and it brings up the options for different graphs. So typically, why does it keep doing that? Oh, it's just when I hover over it. Typically, you'll want something like a bar graph. Here are different options for what bar graphs can look like. And that ended up choosing that one for me, which was not what I was intending to do. And as well, there's line graphs, pie charts, sideways bar charts, area plots. It can't do scatter plot. It can only do a few of these types, but it can do the standard ones like bar graphs. So for the bad data variable, what do you mean by that? Like how to do it automatically?
Oh, I meant like if you called it like one to the data variable, if one of the data was missing, or is there like a formula, Excel formula to do it? I just wonder if you like automatically went through the whole data to code like one by one, or
so what I did was not just to code it one by one.
okay.
Well, okay, like I should be clicked out of this box. What I actually did was, if I was actually doing this data set, I would probably go through and just mark the ones with 1 and not have the 0. I would have it be ones and blanks so that I did not have to type it in for every single one. And that would probably come about, like that would probably be at the experimental stage. I would realize something was wrong and I'd have to go put those in manually. However, if you do have something like bad data due to like there's just a blank in your data, like it didn't record or something. What you can do is you can have it do it automatically by like this formula is blank, and it checks whether it's an empty cell and returns true or false. And so you can just say, if this cell is blank, do true, if not, do false. And so then all the ones that are true, you can filter out that's bad data.
Okay. Oh, that's nice. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Okay, can you show how to group items again? Yes, so here I have up the birth year. And so to group the numeric ones, you click somewhere in this column, you do group. And I wanted to group it in tens. And so I started it at 1970 because I wanted that to be the beginning of the range. And I did it by 10 years. You could also do it by like 5 years instead. And what that would look like would be this. But if you're wanting to group items that are not numeric, you can what you do is you hover over the ones you want to group together, you highlight it, you right click, and I'm not getting this right click to work. Okay, and then you group them in this drop down menu. And this has come up as group 2 on the side and does it that way. Is there a way to add error bars? Let me go back and change this chart type back to columns. Okay, and take out group 2. So add chart element error bars. Let's see. Yes, standard error. And I'm not seeing this right now, but I feel like all these gray boxes over in the corner and stuff, I feel like if you copy one of these charts and then paste it as a picture into Word, I think those go away. I feel like that's been my experience whenever I use this to create my own graphs. So the bad data is I had these over here coded as data that for some reason didn't work out in the experimental process, so I had it coded as bad. And what I did is I added that, let's get rid of this off to the side. I added that as a filter. And before it just included all the data, but now I've added it as a filter and I've said only choose 0, so the ones that are good data. And so now it excludes all the ones that are bad. Does anybody else have any other questions? I will go ahead and, is there anybody who needs the files that I sent out at the beginning?
Yes, I need them, please.
Okay, I will go ahead and put those back in the chat. I think I'll have to close my pivot table data to do that, but I think we're about ready to wrap up. So.
I might have to email you separately again. I remember on Tuesday, it was the same issue where I didn't see anything in the chat, so.
Okay, yeah, sometimes Zoom just does that. But yeah, I would be happy to send it to you over email. So if there are no further questions on this, we'll just wrap up. And you can also just want to let everyone know that the DigiLab, which I work as an assistant there, does offer office hours by appointment. If you go to our website, then you can sign up for appointments and we will talk about things like how to do pivot tables with you if you have any further questions.
Thank you so much, Keiko. This is great. Again, I think we found a new need for our Spring Into Research workshop. So thank you for filling that.
Thank you.